Thank you all for being here today. Can I begin by acknowledging the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. Let's sit ourselves in place just for a moment. I always think it's important to do that when we're talking particularly about immigration and people who've come to this country, and to make sure we spend the right amount of time reflecting on our First Nations peoples and their long connection to this land. Where we are right now, of course, is a sort of an interesting, if you like, because of course the Migration Museum is in close proximity. But if you were to walk directly that way, you would also encounter a place called Freshwater Place. And the reason it's called that is because it marks a location in the Yarra River where there was a small waterfall. And beneath the waterfall is the brackish water from the water coming in from the ocean, and above it was the fresh water. And so traditional owners knew that that was a place to come for sources of food, but also fresh water to support themselves and their family and community. And then, of course, the grasses and everything that extended out towards what we now know as St Kilda, which they used for weaving and baskets and all of these things. So this is the place that we are in. And the people who've been meeting here for tens of thousands of years are doing exactly what we are doing today, which is sharing knowledge and ideas and insights and spending time together to strengthen their communities. So thank you all for being here for that. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Melinda Salento. I'm the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and it's really lovely to have you here for what I think is a pretty important conversation. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank today's sponsors. Our major sponsor, Fragaman, they've been a lead member with CEDA for a long time, and they've been a long-term partner in this conversation. Therese and I were talking earlier about how long it's been, but how long it's been since we first started these conversations is something that I recall and am very much appreciative of in terms of the support that we get from Fragaman. Our other sponsor today is SSI, Settlement Services International, and it's great to have them supporting us in this work as well. And we've been doing research together and supporting each other in really advocating for some important change, I think. So thank you to them also. I think we'll have members of the media here, maybe not, because something else important happened today. But for those who might be in attendance, thank you. It's always great to have you covering our topics and sharing the insights more broadly. Speaking of which, sharing insights, we'd love for you to be engaged in the conversation in the room, but more broadly, please feel free to jump on social media. But also, if you want to ask questions, for those of you in the room, you can do that the traditional way, but you can also scan onto the QR code on your table, which will take you to Pigeonhole. And for those of you on the live stream, you can access the Pigeonhole app. You can ask questions through that app, but also vote on the questions that others have asked. So the issues that are on your minds kind of find their way to the top, and then we make sure that we can get to those if possible, although I suspect there's going to be a fair bit going on, so jump in early if you can. Now, where am I in my run sheet? I should ask you to turn your phones to silent. Every time I see that, I think, do I still need to? But I was at a concert on Sunday night, and apparently, yes, you do. So please turn your phones to silent if you haven't already done so. I just want to spend 2 quick minutes positioning this conversation in CEDA's broader agenda. We have recently launched our Progress 2050 agenda. This is an agenda which sets a long-term vision for Australia. The aim is not to develop the perfect white paper or a solution to every problem that we're confronting, but clearly to put a stake in the ground that says we're not going to make the progress we need if we don't start thinking long-term, and if we don't start articulating the goals and ambitions that we think are important to ensuring prosperity for everyone in Australia. So that's what Progress 2050 is all about. It's shaped by 2 key foundational pillars that are all about our work: a strong economy and a strong social compact. What we are talking about today in migration touches on every aspect of those agendas. We've got 6 goals within them, things ranging from the aspiration that Australian businesses will be amongst the most competitive and dynamic in the world, to 3 different tiers of what a social compact actually means and who it's for and how we deliver it, and migration touches all of them. So it's critically important to our agenda. And can I say at this moment in time, can I just stress how important it is that we actually take a long-term view on migration and don't turn it into a topic that is politicised for the sake of some point scoring over 5 weeks. Because it's too important to us as a country, and it is far too important to the individuals' lives that we are actually talking about. Quickly on to proceedings for today. Shortly we will be hearing from Julia Onso-Cole, who's the Head of Global Government Consulting and Strategy with Fragerman, and then she's joining us virtually. After which we'll be joined in conversation with Elizabeth Collett, who is a Global Fellow at the Migration Institute and doing a bunch of work with the government as well. Then we're going to have lunch. That's going to be a quick fireside chat. We won't be taking questions for that. We'll have lunch and then we'll be followed by a presentation from Fahima Mohammed from Culture Amp and a really cracking panel conversation that we really want you to be involved with as well. After that, I promise that you'll be finished by 2:30. And with that, it is now my great pleasure to invite into the room Julia. Thank you. Sorry, Julia, you good to go?
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So I'm really delighted to join the event today, and I have about 10 minutes to speak to you all, and I just wanted to cover 3 different things. The first was the work that I'm doing advising governments on talent attraction and retention and why this is such a hot topic. The second is to speak about the current geopolitical landscape and in particular the impact the new US administration is having on immigration and global trade and business. And thirdly, I want to look at opportunities for Australia. So looking at the first topic, I think it's really important that governments have good immigration frameworks. And although there is much talk about strengthening borders and the illegal migration, there is undoubtedly a war for talent. I've had a long history of working with governments. I was a formal advisor to the UK government. I attended Prime Minister briefings. I'm still a stakeholder, a formal stakeholder to the UK government. I've worked in projects across Africa. I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia on a project looking at immigration frameworks. I've also done projects with the UAE, Qatar, and very recently with Costa Rica. Some projects have gone better than others. I think a low point of my career was when I was at PwC. I was head of global immigration and legal markets. And it was the night before the announcement of the results of the referendum as to whether or not the UK would leave the European Union. And we were going to do a webinar. And when I left the office, myself and other senior partners at PwC didn't really believe that we were actually going to leave the European Union. And our clients didn't seem to believe that either, because we only had 100 people signed up for this webinar. And then I woke up on the morning of after the referendum to find we'd actually voted to leave the European Union. And when I got to PwC's office, there were 15,000 people that were logged in to listen to me speaking for half an hour on what this result meant for immigration. Well, I personally would love to have known the answer to that. And I had to speak for half an hour on what it all meant when really it was really quite disastrous. But other projects have gone a lot better. And one of the interesting things I've learned is how governments tackle immigration policy. And one of the things that I always think is really interesting is in the UK, there's a lot of discussion about how policies should change, but it takes a very long time for those policies to actually be realized. And Keir Starmer won't mind me saying that. And in fact, I worked closely with him when he was Shadow Immigration Secretary. And just the time that the policy gets announced, it actually, things have moved on so much that the policy doesn't solve for any of the problems that are current. A completely different experience is Dubai. So I sit on the board of the International Board of Dubai Chamber, and I was in Dubai a year or two ago, and I was speaking to the government on a Monday saying, you know what, you really need a visa category to solve for this problem. And then in the same week, on the Friday, I was crossing Dubai in a taxi, and I heard this policy be announced. And it was quite a shock, but it was an amazing example of agility. And although the policy wasn't perfect and it took several weeks for it to be formulated properly, it really is a good example of how, if you can be very agile and also flexible, you can create an amazing immigration framework. I always tell people the story about my own immigration position in Dubai, which was that when in the period of COVID, I was actually meant to be working in Riyadh, but I couldn't actually get into Riyadh because the borders were closed. So I was working in Dubai, and I realized after a while that I was on a remote working visa, and the things I was doing probably didn't conform completely to that visa. So I rang the government and said, oh, I'm a bit worried. I don't think it would look very good if I was actually not compliant with immigration. And they said, oh, we're just announcing the golden visa category, and I think you probably qualify, so send us your CV. So I sent my CV, and my husband, who's a consultant pediatric neurologist, was with me. And I sent his CV too and suggested that he could be my dependent. And then a few days later, literally days, they said, yes, everything's fine, just have a medical. And the medical was amazing. It was completely done by robots. So robot reception, robot giving you a coffee, robot doing your chest scan. It was amazing. And my husband, being a doctor, was just taking lots of photos of all of this. Anyway, then we went along to the visa department to get our visa. And I said to my husband, you've got to be very nice to me now because you're my dependent. And I thought that was quite amusing. And when I gave my passport into the visa department, the gentleman behind the counter said, I said, oh, this is my husband and he's going to be my dependent. And he said, oh no, actually, his CV is so much better than yours. We had a look at it and we've actually given him a golden visa in his own right. So I thought that was, really quite unusual. I mean, very flexible. And it also made my husband feel so proud, and I'm wedded to Dubai, and he's done a lot of pro bono work and training. And it just really shows that if you look after dependents, it really makes a huge difference. I sit on the board of the Permits Foundation, which advocates for working rights for dependents. And Australia is one of our premier green countries, where we've marked green as being exemplary in granting dependents automatic work rights. But I did notice that the CEDA report was talking about some difficulty women were having finding employment. And maybe it isn't an immigration policy, but maybe there is something to do there for dependents. So just moving on to my second area, which is the current geopolitical landscape. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty about what's happening with trade discussions, not just what the US will do, but what countries will do to retaliate, and then what the US might do after this. And this uncertainty is impacting the C-suite of all businesses in the world. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting in Austria with 300 CEOs. And one of the CEOs was saying, after the first announcement of the tariffs on Mexico, we were going to move our manufacturing from Mexico to Texas. But then unfortunately, then there was all of this chopping and changing with regard to the tariffs. So everything's uncertain. And that uncertainty is also impacting the global economy. It's that uncertainty that's really affecting business. We've got the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium exports, which is impacting Australia. We've got new tariffs just announced, 25% on car imports from the 3rd of April. And on the 2nd of April, we expect a whole raft of new tariffs. And as well as affecting businesses because of the uncertainty and the global economy, there's a real pressure on costs. And Australia is in a complex position vis-a-vis its relationship with China and the US. But the Australian government's strategy to diversify and form new trade partnerships is a very sound one. And that's what we're seeing replicated across the whole world. So we're seeing Europe forming a very strong partnership, trade agreement with the Mercosur, Latin America area, with Mexico. They're looking at one with India. The UK want to get closer to Europe. So, also Australia obviously has the uncertainty of the imminent election on the 3rd of May. But, my last point I wanted to make was the opportunities for Australia. So whilst the current situation is challenging, there is opportunities. And it's great that Australia has these pathways to permanent residence. You saw in Australia, so 600,000 people expats leave after COVID. And I think, all countries realize that in the current geopolitical situation, people are looking for permanent residence. Even Saudi Arabia, with brought in a number of pathways to permanent residence. So, this is a really good thing that Australia has done. And the other thing is that where you can see geopolitically that, for example, students might be put off by going to the US at the current time, this is another avenue for Australia. And you might see very well an expansion of your growth of students. And other countries are not taking advantage of this situation. So the UK, in fact, have actually made it more difficult for dependents of students to come to the UK. So, it would be a really good thing for Australia to look at the student avenues in immigration, see how you can even improve them further. Research at universities is one of the outstanding things that Australia has to offer, one of the many outstanding things. And so you could really increase that. So in summary, I just wanted to say, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but Australia has a lot of opportunity and potentially much to gain from creating a very good immigration framework.
Well, thanks for that, Julia. Hopefully we're getting a quick introduction of who we are on stage. As I said, Elizabeth's joining me on stage. Let me obviously start just where you finished off. I think this is the issue on everyone's mind. There's tremendous global uncertainty. A country like Australia has obviously benefited enormously over the recent decades from relatively free movement of goods, of investment and people, as has the rest of the world. I think, we've seen periods of uncertainty and tariffs before, but in some ways this migration of people around the world is something that's been with us for quite a long time. And so, Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you what you think the implications of what we've seen are. We're all digesting it. I mean, it's been 2 months and the changes have been pretty significant, but just interested in what you think this means for migration globally and how you're seeing policy respond and how you think policy might respond.
Well, I mean, as you say, it's early days and I think there's a lot to play out, but I think what we've seen is a raft of measures that have changed the landscape quite fundamentally within the US. I'd highlight a couple of things that I think we need to be aware of. One is, it's important for immigration frameworks to be transparent and predictable. And we've seen now the introduction of capriciousness into some of the immigration decision making in the US. And I think one of the questions is, will that be contagious? Or will other countries feel like that's not who we want to be? we're going to react to that and create stability within our immigration frameworks. And I think we have to be very conscious that immigration processes are only one part of what brings people to a country. The levers you use, the body language of a country matters so much. And the US's body language has changed quite drastically just in the last couple of months. The other place where I think we really have to be conscious of what's going to happen in terms of future migration dynamics is not necessarily something that will impact Australia immediately or possibly ever, is the retrenchment of a lot of overseas humanitarian and development aid funding. I have colleagues at MPI who are trying to understand how much of that is related to migration-specific money. And it's a moving target. They're still trying to figure it out. But their last estimate was very much that of the already obligated funds that have been withdrawn or cancelled in US aid, 800 million were related to migration specifically. And that doesn't count the humanitarian support and the development aid that helps populations adapt and stay in place, particularly in a context of, say, climate change and climate disaster. So what we are going to see is, well, when you take away that kind of the pillars of that support, what's going to happen to migration dynamics? And I think that's something we really have to play out in a context where no other country is going to be able to fill that hole. And indeed, many European countries are shrinking their own aid budgets and thinking more about defence. So we're seeing this enormous sort of situation of change, and we've already spoken about trade overlaying that. But, you know, a couple of bright spots is regional mobility continues whatever. Outside of the US, you see migrants moving for work every day, and it remains, the dynamics remain the same fundamentally. How we treat migrants, I hope, remains the same. And in places like Europe, where the question of the Schengen area of sort of free mobility has been put under pressure and questioned in the last year, including by me, you know, the threat of a trade dispute, the threat of the outside tensions related to trade may actually bring Europe together in more solidarity to maintain that system of free mobility, because suddenly it's more important to create those economies of scale. So it's not all gloomy, but those dynamics are changing so quickly. I think we're going to have to really understand how to pull them all apart and put them back together in a way that maintains a system of global mobility that we can rely on.
Yeah, Julia, can I come back to you and ask you, you finished off sort of looking at the opportunities for Australia, and I'm going to put this in a global context and see if you can provide us any insights on who might be doing this well. It's been so interesting. Post-COVID, we had this real focus here in Australia and everywhere in the world really about skill shortages and a real focus on how do you attract the best and brightest, in the sense that your system had to keep up to be competing, if you like. Then fast forward to cost of living pressures and a whole bunch of other stuff, and that attitude seems to have really shifted. So, you know, in the political context here in Australia, there is actually a lot of angst about the level of migration, including around international students. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about who in the world is sort of managing these conversations well and adjusting their policies to be able to take the most of the opportunities that are being presented by what's happening in the US and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, from all the work that I'm doing with governments, I honestly think there is a public face of governments which seem to be anti-immigration, but that's sort of playing out to a populist feeling. But behind closed doors, there is great anxiety about not having the right skilled labour. So I have not come across any government at all that is not very concerned about, you know, attracting skilled labour, about growth, and, you know, that wants to actually improve their immigration framework in certain ways, so that they are keeping ahead of that war for talent. And because of the global economic situation, they're even more concerned to create things in their immigration frameworks which actually give a boost to growth. So, I mean, I would say, as I said, you know, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they recognize that, you know, they had lots of migrant workers, but they recognize that people want something more permanent, And so they've created all these pathways to permanent residence, as Australia already has. A lot of governments are looking anew at how you can attract certain talent, like, for example, in the gaming industry, where, most of the CEOs of gaming companies are incredibly young, and haven't been to university, haven't actually got any long period of experience, but they've been extremely successful, and it's a new kind of industry. And again, they want to attract these people, but it's no good if you've got an immigration framework which relies on so many years at university, so many years of work experience. So I've seen governments very quickly adapt for that. Another thing is that remote and hybrid working is never going to go away. People enjoy that flexibility and agility. And therefore governments, 60 government countries around the world have provision for a remote working visa. That's something Australia could think about. Again, if you're doing remote working visas, you need to have some immigration and tax alignment, because that's a different thing. So again, I've seen governments really try to get to grips with that. I've seen governments everywhere try to introduce more tech into their processes, to help with process times, and also compliance is a big thing, because again, that plays favorably to people's views if they can see strong compliance, and companies expect that. So I do think a lot's going on, but you might not hear big headlines about it. But underneath the rhetoric, a lot of positive things are happening to try and attract the talent that everybody needs.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm mindful that we're already out of time, but Elizabeth, anything that you wanted to add just on that in terms of what you're seeing around that tension between skill shortages and...
Absolutely. I think I would absolutely agree that, for all the political debate, the concerns about skills shortages are looming large, particularly across Europe. And you're seeing a lot of countries really invest deeply in where they can attract those skills, and building programs that are really drawing on where they see pools of talent around the world, quite focused, and investing money. And that's something to be mindful of. I think one of the things that concerns me slightly is that in many countries, and I think Australia is also here, we can talk about skills shortages, but are we taking a whole of government approach to understanding sector by sector where those shortages are, what that transition of training a workforce versus bringing in a workforce, and indeed training the migrant workforce that's already here into those skills, and thinking about it a little more holistically than we currently do, because we have a conversation about investing $4+ billion into building an Olympic stadium at the same time as we're talking about building houses and a green transition, and yet we're not quite sure where we're going to find that construction workforce. That needs to be a much more consistent conversation, if I can put it that way.
A consistent and long-term conversation as well. I'm just going to put a pin in the fact that I know Fragment's been doing a lot of really interesting work around complementary pathways on labour mobility across the world, and particularly dealing with some of the issues that have been picked up on in terms of displaced people and refugees. And if we get an opportunity in our panel session, Therese, I'm sort of glancing at you, we might sort of pick that up, but also just for the audience, just to know that that's work that's ongoing. So if you're interested in that, don't hesitate to reach out to Fragment. It's lunchtime. We will be back shortly after lunch at 1:25. Thank you for the thumbs up. We'll be back at 1:25 for our live stream viewers, and until then, please enjoy lunch. Thank you. Well, thank you and welcome back to our live stream viewers. Just a quick reminder, if you want to ask questions via the app, scan the QR code. It's the Pigeonhole app. I forgot to mention the password. That was my task at the beginning. Let me find it for you. Surprisingly, 2025 migration. But jump on, I've seen there's some questions already filing in to the app, so if you are wanting to ask questions that way, please jump on. The other thing that you can do as well is scan the QR codes on the table. It's going to tell you who's in the room, And you can get information on our speakers, so I'm not giving you chapter and verse on their CVs because there are plenty of other places for you to find that, and then we'll get to the substance of the issue at hand. It is my great pleasure now to invite to the stage Fahima Mohammed from Culture Amp, who's going to give us her perspectives on migration. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for having me in this incredible event. I am Fahima Mohammadi, and should I tell a little bit about my CV, or I think everyone can read it through the run sheet. And yeah, I'm software engineer at Culture AM company. I want to share my story, how I migrated to Australia, and when I landed here, how was the settlement process for me and for my family. In 2021, August of 2021, by the collapse of our last government in Afghanistan, and when Taliban comes to Kabul, unfortunately, the women and girls were not allowed to study and to go to the work, and they were prohibited from their very basic rights, which is rights to work and rights to study. And that was the reason that me and my family, we decided to migrate to another country for having a bright future for our kids. I have 2 girls, and also for work opportunity for myself. And I was lucky that I found TBB through LinkedIn. I submitted my application through their portal, and after a few months, I received a call from the TBB people, and I passed several interviews with them about my skills, about my work experiences, and then they connected me with companies in Australia, and I was lucky that finally my application processed with Culture AM company, which our company is also, Culture AM is a great company because our mission is in the company to create a better world of work for employees. And our product is kind of providing different services regarding taking service from employees, how to engage them to the work, and about their performance reviews, about their one-on-ones with their managers. This is what we do at Culture Amp. And when I landed, then when my application processed with the Culture Amp through TBB, it took, I think, about 6 months that our visa processed, and we came to Australia through work visa. Me and my family and company sponsored us to be here. And when we landed here, one thing that really surprised me and my family, it was the great culture that we have here in Australia about accepting different people around the world from different countries, different cultures. And for me, honestly, before arriving to Australia, it was always, I was worried that when I arrived there, how will be the new country, how will be the people. And when we arrived there, not just about the company, but I'm talking about the overall culture that we have in Australia. When we were in the markets with my family, the people were so nice about accepting us, and they just respect us really nicely and welcomed us, which was really surprising me and my family. And then about my work in the company, now I think it is about 1 year and 9 months that I'm working with Culture Amp, and I joined in a nice team. Like about our team is about 10 people, which I'm working with them. And now, honestly, we are 12 people because it is extended. And yeah, I find my team really supportive because in our team, we are not just creating application or developing websites, but beside that, we just trying to uplift each other, trying to help each other to grow and to have better impact on the company. And now, yeah, I'm working in the company, and about my kids, I have 2 girls, one is 3 and the older one is 5. The older one, Milika, is at the school now, and the little one is at the childcare. And this migration was honestly like a life opportunity. I can't say it was just a job opportunity for me. It was a life opportunity for me and for my family, for my kids, for my daughters. Now in here, they have the rights to study. At least they have the right to choose about their future and which path they want to go. And yeah, I'm thankful to TBB, their kind team who always supported me during tough time that I had in Afghanistan, and always they tried to create a hope for me that Fahima, you will for sure you will migrate to a new country, you will have a good job opportunity there, and you and your family will have a bright and good future there. And then I'm thankful to Culture AM company, a nice company who has sponsored me and my family, and till now I'm also trying my best to have better impact and as much as possible good impact at the company and perform well as much as I can. Yeah, thank you, Australia. Thank you, TVB, and thank you, Culture.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Well, thank you so much, Fatima. This is having a session like that has become a regular part of our migration conferences, not least because it's so well received by our audiences, but most importantly because it brings to life the real issue that we're talking about. It's easy to talk about policy frameworks and to lose sight of the humanity that sits within them. And so I think it's always really important for us to actually place that firmly in the room and in our conversations. And it's helpful as well because it makes very real some of the more esoteric parts of the conversations that we might be having around what the experience is like. And we can talk about things like, well, what matters and how would we attract more migrants to regional locations, for instance. But actually, it's about finding a fulfilling job. It's about how your family settles in. It's about how welcomed you are. And all of the other things that we all understand in our own lives, but sometimes seem to kind of disconnect. And it's also about giving people a better future for them and their families where they can be their full selves and live their full life. So as we talk about the pointy end of some of these things, I think it's just really important that the humanity of that is first and foremost in our minds and in our deliberations. So thank you again, Fatima. Yeah. I'm now going to introduce our panel. They're going to join me on stage and we'll jump into what I think is going to be a pretty rich conversation. Joining us for the panel conversation are Mamta Chauhan from VETASES, Violet Rumaliotis from SSI, Teresa Liu from Fragaman, John Hart from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Elizabeth, who you met earlier today. So please jump on stage. So thank you everyone, and again please get your questions in. If you're in the room and you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and the team will bring a microphone to you, and as per usual We like questions, not long commentary, and it's always polite to introduce yourself and who you're affiliated with. Oh, Faima, I forgot to tell you too that we're customers of Culture Amp. I meant to say that. We can talk later about how well those engagement surveys in terms of the feedback I'm getting, but let's jump into this then. Obviously, we describe at CEDA the migration policy in Australia. We have described it as a bit of a revolving door. It seems a new strategy kind of every couple of years. 2023, we had a new migration strategy announced that reflected really serious consultation. And I think our assessment at CEDA was a really good framework to try to actually avoid the revolving door in the future. That was the hope for that. I guess the opening question really is how do we think that's going so far? And I'm looking for someone, Mamta.
Happy to make a start. So, hi everyone. From VEDISIS. VEDISIS is one of the largest skills assessment bodies supporting skilled migration. And VEDISIS is part of the Bendigo Kangan Institute. So I guess in my responses, there is the manifold perspectives that I bring in here as well. When you talk about migration reviews, I think that has been a constant. Since 2010, when we moved across from ASCO to ANSCO, new classification, a qualification plus experience from qualifications only, there has been a constant review of the processes, and the impacts are manifold. And the one thing to note is that on the one hand is Australia and what we are thinking as a nation about migration, what we need to change, how we need to refine. There is also the geopolitics across the globe. And both of these will have an impact on what we're seeing in terms of migration in Australia. So to start off, this year, as an assessment body, we are receiving far more applications than we anticipated. And we trigger that more to what's happening across the globe. And if US or if Canada is appearing too tight, where do the migrants go? I often use this analogy, and I know it's a bit overused, but I'll use it today. Hopefully there's a lot of new audience here. The prospective migrants are like the River Nile. They need to migrate. They need to move. They want to go to a country for a better life. They're looking for options. You close 3 doors, they say, oh, that one door is still open. We'll try and find and steer our way. So what we're finding is that even though there's a lot of narrative and a lot of changes in migration, which may be aimed at refining, the demand and the need is still there. So we're still we're seeing an overreaction to migration at a stage.
Yeah.
I mean, I might just jump in if that's okay, because I think geopolitics definitely has something to play in it, but representing a number of clients, I think a lot of clients were looking for certainty. So certainty in the process, and for migrants themselves, particularly those on temporary visas, are really looking to that pathway and settlement and a guaranteed permanent residence kind of outcome as well. So similar to you, I think that migration strategy was actually a good one because it did give a good framework. And I suppose I wanted to highlight some of the positives that have come out of it. So I do think there is greater ease to gain permanent residency when you're here, and that is a good thing. I also think that there is also greater ability to move between employers. So that kind of mobility kind of aspect is also, I think, helpful, all around. But then there's some other aspects, I think, that they haven't been left on the table but have been implemented, and I do think need to be either further implemented or reviewed. So for instance, the new National Innovation Visa, which basically collapses a lot of the other, some other categories like the Investor Visa, the Global Talent Visa, Business Owner, Entrepreneur. I think that does need some review. I think there's been something like 2,500 applications of an expression of interest, and only 7 have actually been asked to apply. And I think that says a lot about, are you actually bringing in that high talent, and are the barriers a little bit too high in an environment where we do need to innovate? And then the other one is obviously the skills in demand visa, which is our kind of bread and butter, and I think for a lot of people here as well. I mean, really right now, there's been more tinkering around the edges, I would say, but the fundamentals haven't really been reviewed. I know that the essential skills, which is where all your lower skilled labour agreements are, definitely needs further review, but this issue around occupation lists and will that be further refined down, the uplifting of the TISMIT and labour market testing, which still remains, actually means that there hasn't actually been a lot of change going on, and it may not actually meet some of those critical skill shortages that we're experiencing still.
There's a couple of things in there that I'm going to come back to, and it's interesting because you can join the dots too to some of the comments that Julia made around some of the challenges that the system is bumping into, and she was talking about gaming as a sector, but it is, one of the things I know we've talked about is when you've got new and emerging skill demands and sectors, how do you actually fit them into the system and fit them in quickly and in a timely way when some of the ways in which we assess the eligibility are pretty blunt instruments? And I know we've had, Julia mentioned how you think about skills, how you think about experience. We've got the kind of blunt instrument, which is a wage level, which again, depending on how skilled or experienced you are, is not necessarily the best either. So let's come back to that because I will also want to talk about essential skills. John, I've got a question for you, but hold that for a second. I'm going to come to Elizabeth. You're sort of in the system, and I'm going to out you a little bit for the conversation we were having before lunch, which is how, it's great to have a strategy, it's great to have clarity around this. How it works in practice is never what it's going to be on paper. And one of the things that we were talking about is how responsive the system is and the agencies are to being able to pick up on what is being felt in practice and incorporate and process that. What are your perspectives on that?
Oh, it's a difficult question. I'm glad that's the part of our pre-lunch conversation you picked up on, not the immense amount of swearing that I did while my mic was off. I think what's interesting is, one thing I've noticed is there is an enormous amount of effort spent in the selection and the visa process itself, and an almost casual approach to what happens to people once in country with their visa in hand, and perhaps a little bit of rebalancing in terms of then how are people doing, which can then inform where your needs are in the future, and I'm sure we'll come on to that issue of skills recognition. So I think that's one thing. I think there's often also an overemphasis on counting and counting numbers of people coming in and going out, and not necessarily understanding the qualitative aspects of how people are doing and being more responsive to that. I don't know, I'm curious to know what this room thinks, but I've been impressed with Jobs and Skills Australia delving a little more deeply into some of the sectoral issues with international students, with early childhood workforce, to try and unpack some of these issues. And I wonder how we translate that back into a sort of Home Affairs department that can sort of link up a little bit more with some of its counterparts around. But I do think there is a real opportunity to think about what role different constituencies can play once people are in country. Where employers don't want high turnover, they want happier workforce that will stay for a long time. It reduces the overall cost of doing business and it creates happy workforces. So where are the opportunities there to build that into the community support for someone arriving in country, and ensuring that there are those broader incentives to stay in place because people feel part of a broader community. There's a role for the employer, there's a role for the local authority, there's a role for community organisations who I think are actually bearing most of the responsibility at the current time. And so I think there is a lot of work that could be done that's interesting. And I make a small plug for Europe in that I think Europe has made huge strides in the last 20 years in really thinking about this and what it takes to financially support and then bring everyone in to be part of that discussion and that process.
Yeah, which is so important in the sort of broader social licence, which, can I just flag, is an issue coming up in the context of the politics of this. I am going to get to those questions, I promise. But John, I wanted to ask you about the perspectives of the sector you're closest to, which is tourism and hospitality. it often attracts a lot of attention in terms of the workers that are coming from overseas to work in the sector. Sometimes the right attention, sometimes the wrong attention. How are you seeing the new strategy playing out for you and your members?
The important thing is, I think, to just have a bit of an understanding of the sector. 1.2 million employees, currently 170,000 vacancies, and the majority of those vacancies will be filled by overseas workers in one shape or form. And therefore, we're very exposed to migration. The strategy itself and the review that preceded the strategy, great in theory, but in practice, I think there's been a lot that's gone missing. The first thing is we assumed that if we were looking at a skills in demand visa, if we had that sort of skill shortage, we would have skills in demand across our whole sector, yet the actual rollout of the core skills consideration removed some of our occupations with very, very large numbers in them. So it's been the implementation of what was a very sound review and a very sound strategy where things have really gone wrong. To the point that was made earlier, we need to get to the nuance of some of the definitions that we're talking about here. I mean, if you look at some of our occupations, obviously cooks and chefs is big for us and is top of the pops in most migration programs. We're dealing in an environment where we have to get people from the migration program, because when we go out on a Saturday night, the first question we ask ourselves is what restaurant we're going to go to, and we might choose an Italian restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, an Indian restaurant, or one of many others. We actually need to have people that we bring into this country with skills, culinary skills in each of those areas, each of those cuisines. So it's a lot more complex in our environment than just setting a threshold number, just setting a series of threshold occupations. We've really got to get much more deeply into the nuances of the type of people we need to fill the gaps we have in our workforce.
So I think you've already picked up on a theme here around what seems like quite a lot of focus on numbers. Any of us who've been involved in this conversation know that actually, and but we tend to have a conversation on big numbers, but not necessarily some of the others that you need to contemplate. And I'm thinking here about international students, where people look at large inflows, but then don't actually look at how many stay in the country for how long and all the rest of it. So more nuance, definitely. Violet, I haven't forgotten you. I promise you I haven't forgotten you. One of the things, I think we talk about the importance of skilled migration. I think there is support for skilled migration, where we're bringing in people who are adding to our sort of human capital stock and plugging the sorts of gaps that we know are really important to supporting investment and opportunity, etc. But we've done work on this topic, you and CEDA, around what we call the skills mismatch. So people coming into the country and not then being able to actually utilise the skills that ideally we would like. It goes to their own experience and joy at being here or not, plus the benefit to employers. And I'm going to put a big number on the table, which is 620,000 permanent migrants who are currently working below their skill level. That means less benefit to their employers, less benefit to them in terms of the wages that they could realise. Why does it happen, and what should we be doing about it?
I might start with the impact, perhaps, that it has when we don't do it right. SSI, worked with Deloitte Access Economics last year to quantify the economic cost of this skills mismatch. And we found that it costs the Australian economy $9 billion every year. I'm sure you all agree that's an extraordinary number, which works out to about $24.7 million every day. But we shouldn't also consider only the economic impact, it's also the human impact. And as Melinda said, 620,000 people who arrive it's an extraordinary number. For those permanent migrants who are here in Australia, who are not working at their skill level, it's deeply personal. Let's say the problem is deeply personal because they cannot continue the career that they had, and they can't take the skill set that they had every day to work with them. And this causes a lot of frustration and, I guess, a lot of mental health and other issues. And there is a sense that if all of your experience and your expertise over decades accounts to nothing. I think that I would also look at it personally because I've witnessed skills mismatch from when my parents were Greek immigrants arrived in the 1950s. So as a young girl, seeing that, the impact on my parents and family and the broader Greek community, and in my professional role now, working with a settlement organisation, I see and talk to people every day for the decades that I've worked that have experienced this skills mismatch. So it's been a protracted issue. And I think for all of you, you would look at it personally because it is just not these random people. They're actually our family, our friends, they're our neighbours, the barista at our local cafe, our colleagues, and if nothing, the Uber driver that we all speak to when we jump into their car. And so I guess the key point is that we need to recognise it's not a migrant issue, it's actually an issue that impacts all of us. And if you consider that 1 in 3 occupations we just heard have got terrible skill shortages, and that 90% of Australian businesses tell us that they don't have enough skilled labour, those shortages impact very much on all of us, the costs of services and long waiting lists. So I guess that the fact there's 620,000 permanent migrants living in Australia today who are ready and willing to work in the fields that they're qualified and can, really fill those skill gaps because they were assessed and received skilled visas for the very skill set that they have because Australia needs them. So they arrive ready and willing to go, and this is where we come to the why. Then there is no connection between the migration part and the skill part. And a 2006 Select Committee migration report said, I think, very powerfully, that if one starts at the wrong spot, they can find themselves lost in a bureaucratic muddle where they can't go back or forward. And I think that if you consider that we have 80 assessing authorities in this country that cover 650 occupations, it is unbelievable. There is not one government entity that oversees the end-to-end skills assessment and qualification system, which means that there's no one looking at quality and consistency and at best, the best results for our workforce, Australian workforce and our industries. And other than the medical profession and trades, all the other assessing bodies and professional bodies are unregulated or self-regulated. And this is an important issue because, as you would understand, private and public will then create their own framework around costs, around documentation required, about timeframes. And this is the key driver for skill underutilisation and skills mismatch, because if you can understand, a newly arrived skilled migrant is not entitled to any income support for 4 years, the first 4 years. So you've got to get a job, you've got to work. Those costs, it would take some people years to save up the money just to go through the system. And there is no national subsidy at this stage to support or help. And the migration assessment aspect, they set their own fees, and depending on the occupation, it can be as little or as large as they want. And so it could, and obviously as a doctor going through the system today, it can cost $51,000 and take up to 150 weeks to get registered. And finally, I guess there's no authoritative central body where someone can go and say, all right, I've got these skills. Do I need them to be registered or qualified to work in my area? There's no one source of truth. And so what they do is they rely on WhatsApp groups or informal websites, and inevitably they're misinformed and quite often exploited. So I hope that gives a picture of some of the impact and the why.
A pretty rich and complex picture. I'm going to jump in on, I'm going to bring Mamta and Teresa in on this issue around skills recognition. I mean, it was described as, you know, nicely as complex and burdensome in the Parkinson review. I think the case for change, really obvious and evident. And can I just say, everything that you just described, Violet, also lends itself to an environment where people who are demanding those skills can actually bring bias and preconceived ideas to their decision-making process, and which is deeply unhelpful. But interested in the perspectives of both of you. Mum, perhaps you first, around where we're at, what needs to change, and can we do this faster than we have been?
Yeah, and just Violet, for clarification purposes, so VEDISIS is one of the 40 assessing authorities, and then there are a few more for the trades area as well. And we're all regulated. We're all regulated by the Federal Department of Employment and Workplace Relationships. And there is a specific team that oversees. We have, I think, Computer Society present here today. We all report into an APA branch within DUA. And they are the ones that regulate and stipulate guidelines for all assessing authorities, picking up on the review and the recommendations that have come out of the Parkinson's as well. They have now reviewed their guidelines, and currently we know those new guidelines will come into effect at some stage in 2025 and will be applying to all assessment authorities. But we do have to work under their framework and within their guidelines as well. And they stipulate how do we approach skills assessment. Of course, on the point that whether it's too complex or the benchmark is too high, one thing that we have started initiating, and John Hart is one of the key stakeholders we engage with, is getting the industry input into formulating what the criteria should be. What does the industry need? Do you really need qualifications? Do you just need experience? Do you need a combination? And based on that, reviewing our criteria and our approach as well. Similarly, for the trade occupations that we assess, they are regulated by Trades Recognition Australia, and they then stipulate the assessment criteria that applies across to all trade assessments for migration purposes as well.
Teresa?
So I would say, as representing many employers, it is truly cumbersome and it's really complex, and I think it goes to the heart of, I mean, you just mentioned all these layers, right? And then consultation to get to somewhere at a particular point in time. And John, you mentioned around the nuances, and I think this is where there is this massive mismatch. So you have an employer maybe in tech who's requires a pretty specialised skill set, and this is an example. And yet it's really hard for them to get through the gates to get a positive skills assessment, but the need is really clear. And then you have a number of skills assessing authorities who I think are resource thin as well. I mean, I'm just, it's not part of their it is their day job, but they've got many other things on board as well. And, how do you reconcile a pretty fast moving pace of what the need is, the intricacies and nuances of that, and then overlay that with, an assessing authority? I mean, I think Fragment are really keen to see internationally credentialing on many occupations, and I think, I really would go to the basis of, if we're really going to simplify the migration skilled system, you need to trust the employer. The employer is the person that is, interviewing that individual, knows their business, needs the skill, and we should be trusting the employer to make the right decision. So whether it's on an assessment point of view or frankly on labour market testing, I mean, I think we really put people through hurdles, whether it's an employer or, an employee as well. So
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's one of the things that we found through CEDA's research as well, is that the visas driven by employers, you had much lower incidences of skills mismatch. And it makes sense because we can talk about qualifications, but you're also talking about a broader fit for the organisation in terms of experience and the things that you're looking for that employee to bring to add to your existing sort of workforce. I'm going to ask you a question in a second, John, just about your perspectives, but Elizabeth.
Yeah, just to say, I absolutely agree. This is a major challenge, and leaving that much potential on the table seems almost tragic in the context of our current conversations. But I think there's also an additional layer to that, which is social recognition of the skills presented by employers. And if employers are fully informed about, when they're presented with a CV, what do those skills on that piece of paper mean? Even if there's no formal recognition requirement, what does that look like? And there's also, I think, an attitude towards that perhaps needs to change. I was talking to Betsy from ACS in the break. You know, their survey of IT expertise shows that social recognition of the skills presented by IT workers means that there is a skills mismatch. So the formal piece is important. The soft piece, I think, is equally critical in terms of educating on what certain skills present. And my own experience personally, but also experience with returning Australians who've been overseas, who all say they face the sinking feeling of knowing that everything they did overseas won't really matter in the job market, including in the Australian public sector, which is really quite worrying. That, you know, if you go overseas, you may take a career hit when you come home. So I think there is also a deeper problem, which is not to draw away from this one, but there is, I think, something more deeply embedded in, do we recognise what that
and I'm going to come back to that because there's a question here that sort of goes to that. But John, I did want to just ask for if you wanted to add anything in terms of your experience in the sector and what you're hearing from employers.
I think there's a really good example of this skills mismatch, and that is in restaurant and cafe managers. If you think about going to a restaurant in Australia and going to a restaurant anywhere else around the world, you'll see that there's a very large difference between what it is to operate a restaurant in Australia and what it is to operate a restaurant in the rest of the world. And a basic occupational descriptor drawn from ANSCO back then will not give you any insight as to the skills you actually need to do that job. And what we expect in those roles in Australia is very different to what is expected in those roles elsewhere around the world. So whilst you might have experience and all sorts of other things, you don't have skills in implementing food safety planning and all of that sort of stuff that we expect in Australia. So it's not until we get to unpack the sort of occupational descriptor and go through a process of defining what the skills assessment looks like that you can in any way get someone that's adequate to fill that job in Australia. And we went through that process with VetAssess and picked apart the assessment process and what the skills were we were looking for. As soon as we did that, it totally changed the type of people that were getting through those skills assessments. So you really do need to get into the weeds to make it work.
Yeah. The question that's that I wanted to touch on here is one from Anson, who's talking about is enough being done to tap into the skill set of migrants when they arrive? And I think we've talked about the mismatch, which is really evident. But I think, Elizabeth, just picking up on your point, is that increasingly, and a bit what you're saying, John, too, is that there's a broader breadth of skills that sometimes sits within these qualifications that we need or migrants are bringing. And can we do a better job of tapping into the skills that migrants are bringing, either formal, informal, soft, however you want to describe them, including to fill gaps in these really emergent sort of sectors and industries, whether it's manufacturing or, to rejuvenate that and to bring a different perspective to that, or whether it's a climate transition. Elizabeth, you're nodding. Do you want to jump in on that?
I think one of the major challenges actually is data. So, you have states and territories who've set aside bits of budget in order to do introduction sessions and labour fairs, employment fairs, and to try and help with that situation. But they struggle to get the information about who is arriving in their state and territory if they're not on a very specific kind of visa. And so having knowledge about who is arriving and having, I think, more proactive outreach in terms of information and orientation and helping people find those employment services that are going to help them is a key missing piece. And I can speak from experience. I'm a partner. I came here on a partner visa. It's the first time I've come without a job. And at no point did anyone say, would you like to join the labour market? Turns out I don't actually have any useful skills, so probably wouldn't have helped in my case. But working for think tanks in the UN, not going to get you anywhere. But where is that follow-up? Even if it's as simple as a text message or a follow-up saying, we've made you an appointment at this place, would you like to join? Because, it's not just people who come in who are selected for their skills, it's everyone who comes in who have skills but have not been selected for that per se. And I think there's an enormous amount of work that can be done there, which is, I think, easy, but has some very nitty-gritty things you have to fix in order to get it done.
I'd just probably say, like the skilled migration program as it stands, it's so employer-led. So the migration program or planning program at the moment, they did do a significant increase in the employer-led program compared to independent skilled, as an example. And that's how they're trying to solve for this mismatch, frankly. And then you look at dependents, kind of on that, and I think there is a real opportunity because dependents, and I know CEDA have done a report on this, particularly say women who come in and they want to enter the workplace, maybe they've come with young children, have real difficulty then kind of establishing themselves and so on. But, I think even on things like the new National Innovation Visa, it's all based on you'll get better through the gates if you have experience here, if you've got experience here. Like, it really doesn't cater very well for proving experience overseas unless you have an employer. So the other way to tackle is how do you match employers to employees a little bit more kind of closely, and this is where I'm just going to give a bit of a plug to complementary pathways and refugees and displaced people, and Talent Beyond Boundaries is here today, is that what they do is they try to do that piece of the matching and then the visa to try to recognise that it then means that you've got a real person and that person has basically that safety of coming in and being employed, hopefully in that right kind of skilled role and so on.
I just want to comment that there is a range of services, settlement services, for example, that the Commonwealth funds, but we're in a unique situation and irrational really in Australia where services are provided based on the visa type you have rather than the need. So this is exactly what Liz was saying around partners. You've got the secondary applicant who's totally neglected, and they could be equally qualified, better qualified, and eager to work, and they've got experience, they've run businesses, but there is no one tapping in and saying, what is your aspiration, what do you want to do? So on that human level, but also in terms of need in the communities that they work, and there is this terrible situation. That's why I talked about this. No one government entity actually coordinating. Why we sort of launched the Active Australia Skills campaign in October last year was for that exact reason, that employers and industry bodies and community and people have lived, who are here and say, I want to work and I can't. There is no one coordinating across government. And so, there are 4 key reforms. And there is, I believe, an appetite, because I know that the Parkinson Review said it's really complex and possibly in the too hard basket. But I think there's many of us in this room that there is an appetite for reform. And when you have tripartite, public, private and civil society coming together, you can achieve a lot of things. I believe that the 4 key reforms of this campaign, and we've got 100 organisations supporting it, and prominent Australians, including Melinda, who are standing by the campaign, Parkinson and Arthur Sinodinos and Gillian Triggs and many others, because there is a belief that 4 key reforms. The first one governance system across the country with an ombudsman with regulatory powers, so that the ombudsman can shine some light, bring some transparency, accountability, maybe set some guidelines, and listen to appeals, etc. And the second is around a seamless system between migration and between immigration and between employment, because the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And that causes a lot of confusion. And the third is around providing a support around the barriers that people have. First key barrier is cost, so looking at subsidies. The second key barrier is information, a portal in language that says if you're a trained engineer from overseas or a carpenter and you want to work in Australia, this is what you need to do, step by step. And the last one, reform, is migrant employment pathway hubs that are place-based. And you could be working, but you want to go back into the profession you were qualified. You'll have navigators there to support you to get through the system. And newly arrived newcomers of all visa types could also access there to get support. I mean, so 2 of them are systemic and 2 of them are around practical support. And lastly, I just wanted to make the comment that we can all provide, we could all, if we left this room today and thought, what's one thing I can do? We could all do something that could make a change. The first key thing is, if you're on a board or you work somewhere, challenge your system of how you recruit. There's a lot of unconscious bias. Many of these people we're talking about today don't even get through the front door. Their application, we had a large recruiting company saying that employers were saying, do not send me applications of names of people we can't pronounce or even spell. Yeah. So we have to acknowledge some racism and prejudice in our labour markets.
Thank you for calling out a bit more directly. I was being a little bit soft when I said that earlier, but this is exactly what I was saying. I'm going to pause. Is there any questions in the room? I knew this would happen. We'd be gas bagging up here. I'm going to ask my next sorry, first of all, I'm going to set this up. I'm giving everyone forewarning that there's about 4 or 5 questions in the pigeonhole that kind of relate to the same issue, which is the challenge of what you might describe as social licence for migration in Australia, which is why it's becoming politicised. So I'm going to ask each of you to sort of talk about what we might do to actually kind of address the issue of misunderstanding and misinformation around the impacts of migration and actually build stronger social licence. And related to that, is there 1 or 2 policy issues that you think are really important in terms of trying to anchor this long term? So that's forewarning. Teresa, you don't get time to think because I'm going to ask you a question while everyone else is thinking. And I wanted to come back to the issue around, you mentioned labour market agreements. And I think this is a really interesting issue because we've at CEDA been really strong advocates for an essential skills visa. To recognise that we rely heavily already on a migrant workforce in our care economy, in our care sector. We've got a massive care workforce shortage for decades to come, and how we make sure that we can develop a really consistent pipeline that brings people in with the skills and experience, and this is also a soft skills area, which is why everyone calls them low skill jobs when they absolutely are. And so we've been really advocating for that. There is rightfully concern around how this sits alongside of domestic education and training. And because of that, I think there's been a reluctance to sort of necessarily go the same path as a business skills visa. And we're in the labour market space, labour market agreement space to make sure we deal with that. We're hearing that it's not working. We're not seeing enough growth in the workforce coming in and that it's cumbersome. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that and what you're hearing.
So we do quite a lot of work in this space, and it is such a patchwork of agreements that we need to navigate for an employer needs to navigate. So, for instance, like an Aquila labour agreement, which is a template, and then you have to overlay that with designated area migration agreements. You then need to have different agreements depending on every state because your stakeholders, including unions, are different in every single state. So the terms are going to be different that you negotiate state by state for that same occupation. And on top of that, that same employer might also be using the business, the normal business sponsor system. And on top of that, sorry, going back to labour agreements, might also need a company-specific agreement because neither of those other agreements actually put in a specific concession and they really need someone. So we actually have employers that have a multitude of labour agreements, different expiries, different concessions, different caps, and it's really complex. So in terms of, it kind of works in the sense of ultimately there's a solution, but it's really messy and it's not consistent, and it's really hard to administer for them to kind of manage, be compliant and so on, particularly, you know, at those renewal stages every year as well. So I think if there was a better simplified system where you can go across the board as opposed to so many, would really be helpful. The other point is these applications by definition therefore take a really long time to negotiate, get in place, and then the processing times, I think on every visa is something like 70 days compared to specialist skills, which is I think about 12, 13 days at the calendar days as well. So in terms of bringing in the people, there is a huge amount of stress to bring in people pretty urgently, but it just takes a very long time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we've been hearing, and it's, you know, of course, the context for this is a sector where a very large proportion of businesses are really struggling to make ends meet as well, and partly because they can't, in the aged care sector, for instance, they can't necessarily have all their beds available because they don't have the workforce, and so you sort of end up in this chicken and egg. Okay, we've got a little bit of time left. I really want to get to this question which traverses about half of the questions on the Pigeonhole app, which is really around this this sort of social license piece. You know, each one of us in one way or another is trying to advocate for knowledge and information around the impact in the system and how we can make the system work better for everyone. But just interested in your thoughts about how we can kind of move the dial a bit more on this. I'll start with you, John, and then just sort of work down.
I think it's very much related to our previous discussion. That is, if you eliminate or minimise the skills mismatch, you're going to get the right people in the country doing the right sorts of work. And if that picture emerges, you're not going to have skill shortages that are deep, but you're also not going to have some of the stresses in the system that we currently have. You know, if we've got the right people in the right locations doing the right things, all of the stresses on housing and the stresses on transport and all of that sort of infrastructure starts to reduce. So I think it really is about getting the system right so that we have the right people doing the right jobs that starts to allow us to get that social licence. I mean, I believe that the industries that I'm in are the perfect industries to start to build that social licence. Yeah. Because, you know, everyone wants to go out to an Italian restaurant or an Indian restaurant or whatever, and to start building that relationship with those cultures to understand what they're going through should start at the restaurant down the road. So, yeah. You know, but we've got to get this skills alignment piece right first so that we can then start to build that social licence.
So people have sort of trust and faith in the system.
In the system,
yeah.
Exactly.
Teresa?
Yeah, so kind of like trust and faith in the system is kind of interesting. I mean, I might go back towards, you know, in terms of the federal election and the budget. You know, both sides are looking at a reduction in the net overseas migration as an example, and it's all around housing, essentially. And I think there just needs to be more accuracy about what that actually is. And then when you look at, you know, potentially a 25% reduction in permanent migration, where is that going to occur? Like when you look at it, where is that going to occur? Is that really going to occur in the skilled program with 70% of the migration numbers, or is it going to occur in the humanitarian or the family? Like, it needs to come out from somewhere. And then what is that impact and how does it affect your real skill shortages? And then you can go on, like students. Students are a feeder into skill shortages. Like that's your pipeline. So by linking students directly to housing again, it's just a little really blunt. So what I do like is that there was discussion around migration planning levels that will span a 4-year period rather than 1 year, because that does give a better ability to look at infrastructure and settlement and services and so on. So you're building a better story around making sure that there's a good balance between the needs and that there is an infrastructure in place to support that as well. So I think, I don't know, it's a bit of a difficult question, but that's just kind of like, I think we just need to dispel some of these maybe...
Bit of myth busting.
Bit of myth busting?
Well, a bit of myth busting and a bit of truth telling about where it's really going to come from, and then what you might actually do that does address the issues without, whilst also delivering the sort of economic and community benefits, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Melinda, I think you asked before the question that which country has cracked the code, as in doing it better as well. I guess I came to Australia on the back of a Vedasis skills assessment for my husband. We weren't sponsored by Vedasis, so I'll just declare that. At that point of time, when I wanted to look for a job, I wasn't pointed to settlement services or talent beyond boundaries. I was asked to go to Centrelink to see if they could help me, Services Australia now. And they put me in front of a computer and said, that's a computer, go and look for a job, right? Hence, it took me 4, 5, 6 months through a referral finally to get my first job in Australia. Once you're through the door, then it becomes easy. Once you've demonstrated your skills and your ability to perform, then I think the pathway is much easier. I would say from 2007 to now, things definitely have changed. They're not ideally where they exactly need to be, but a lot of good work is happening. Settlement services is gaining traction in Australia. The work that you're doing in mobility pathways, they're good pieces of work, but we're not hearing about it enough. And I think, to Violet's point, having that central hub, we know at TAFE we have the English language program that is now being, to support any students from migrant communities. We have jobs and skill centres as well. So good things are happening in pockets, regional Australia. We're hearing good stories around migration and how that social license and everything is getting better in areas. And I think we just need to hear a bit more good stories about how migration is doing well for Australia.
Fantastic. Now, for you two, you've each got 2 minutes or less, because we're running out of time.
Okay. I just say that I think migration is more than numbers. It really is about nation building, and bringing in different skills is just the way that, as a country we decide. But we really need to have a vision in our leaders that acknowledge that skilled migration and migration is good for the country, and I think the politics of fear and division really does a disservice to all of us. And there is ways that we can actually have a vision for the sort of country that we want, the economy we want, the innovation, and then we can really attract people respectfully here and welcome them as members of the community who want to live long lives here. And I think that's what's lost, because we can fix the system, but it's really about leadership and about the approach that we take.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth, last word for you.
Well, I think we've just seen in the US exactly what happens when social license collapses. We saw this with the Democrat Party in the last election. The concept of humanitarian parole for people from Venezuela, Haiti, etc., coming in large scale and monthly is a laudable one to people who work on migration and part of a comprehensive plan, and it was a beautiful idea. There was a fear about communicating it. And because of that fear of communicating, people didn't understand what was happening and felt like this was something being done by stealth. And now we've seen what happens. You're about to see the same thing happen, I think, with blanket deportation and the breadth of deportation. If you look at the Pew Research Centre's latest survey on how people feel about deportation, you see the same lack of social license for trying to deport everybody. There is very much a nuanced view on what that should look like for the America. So, and again, not much communication. There's a lot of surging ahead with action. So the big takeaway is communication is key. And I think one practical thing I can suggest is an organisation called More in Common, who is based in the UK and Germany and a number of other places, who do polling and have really tried to break down attitudes towards immigration, and are about to embark on a whole new set of surveys that try and contrast the trade-offs involved with migration. Would you rather? A game of would you rather, if you would. Effectively saying, Would you like more infrastructure in your community or less migration? Would you like an Olympic stadium or fewer construction workers? You know, what are these trade-offs? And really try and bring them together and understand them and take people through an iterative process of there is some hard choices here. It's not that they are hard choices now, partly because there has not necessarily been the planning of the recent decades. So what does that look like and how do we take that forward? And I completely agree with Teresa that this idea of the multi-annual planning and state level planning in particular is I think very, very valuable for Australia if they can get that right.
Yeah, look, thank you all for those insights, and I think that you know, that really resonates with me, that sense of you've got to ask the next, it's the nuance, it's the qualitative, it's the, you know, thinking about what we're really talking about, thinking about this is about people, but also challenging around, oh, that sounds really nice, you know, let's lower immigration, but what does that actually mean? And where is that actually going to be felt? Because so, you know, I think so much of the impact has been conflated in the negative and scapegoated, quite frankly. But then when the response is projected, that sort of, you know, well, hang on, what does that actually mean in reverse is not fully interrogated either. And I think you get a sense of, oh, if we've capped that and we haven't seen house prices going down, oh, then we actually have to go further. So I think that sit in the issue, bring the nuance, bring the conversation, and always make it human is the thing that we're all going to have to do. And the final comment really is leadership. And I think we have to, each in our own way, try to show that leadership through the issues that we talk about, the conversations we curate, and the positions that we take. Can you join me in thanking the panel? Thank you to the live stream audience for being a part of our conversation today. It's been a great one in the room, and we're glad that you could join us to be a part of it as well. Can I thank our sponsors again, Fragaman and SSI. I should have thanked you as well, Violet, for putting me in the company of Craig Foster. You know, that's probably a more prominent Australian to rattle off, I should say. For those of you in the room and online, as always, we've got a long list of interesting events coming up. Now that politics is down tools or policy making, I don't know how you think about the next couple of weeks before the election. We've got plenty to keep you occupied if you'd rather not read all about those shenanigans. So jump on the website and have a look. Here in Melbourne on the 16th of April, we've got conversation with the Lord Mayor, Nicholas Rees. We've got an absolutely cracking climate and energy summit here on the 1st of May. That is a topic that we all need to be focused on. I think everyone's kind of sitting on their seats a little bit waiting to see what the election result is. Doesn't matter really, it's a long-term issue and we should all be talking about it and all be engaging with it and saying the things that we actually think need to be said and driving the consistent, certain policy that it will underpin future prosperity. So a bit of a small plug for that one. And then on the 23rd of May, when we will have a new federal government, we will have the Victorian State Budget Address. So thank you all again for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you at one of those events in the future. Have a great day.